Educational material for teaching Latvian history. Spring of 2003. An act of vandalism has been committed in Jelgava, in the so-called Death Forest. Somebody has smeared with paint and desecrated the memorial stones placed at the site of the extermination of Jews during World War II. Jelgava, summer of 1941, Holocaust. Standing here by the memorial site, one needs to ask many questions. In August 1939, two totalitarian powers, the communist regime of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Joseph Stalin and Nazi Germany under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, signed a pact dividing the world. Latvia became a target for the Soviet Union. It all led to events that destroyed Jelgava, exterminated some of its population, and left traces whose consequences can still be felt today. In 1940, Jelgava and the whole of Latvia were occupied by the Soviet Union, and the so-called Year of Terror started. Latvia lost its independence, was taken over by a great power, and was subject to what we call today genocide against a nation.
Latvijas tauta ir zaudējusi savu valsti un nokļuvusi lielvaru rokās un izbauda to, ko šodien mēs dēvējam par genocīdu pret tautu.
As a result of the pact between the Soviet Union and Germany, the first to disappear from Jelgava were the German minority. They had to leave Latvia and go back to Germany. The repressive Soviet authorities in the first days of occupation started arrests of Latvian citizens. A week before June 22, 1941, when the war started between Germany and the Soviet Union, thousands of inhabitants were deported to the eastern regions of the Soviet Union. If the time planned for the extermination of Latvians was relatively longer, the extermination of the Jewish and Romani population was to be accomplished during the first days and weeks of the war. Sandra Steinerte, a student of Jelgava's Spidla High School. I've been studying history for 7 years. I know about World War I and II, and also about genocide, and that Jews and Poles were murdered. But so far, I did not know about this particular memorial site. Neither had I known that many Jews were killed in Jelgava. Settlers came to Kurzeme during the times of the Kurzeme Zemgala Duchy in the 17th century. They settled in Jelgava, and the city even had its own Jewish street. In 1710, a Jewish cemetery was opened on the outskirts of Jelgava. In 1784, the first synagogue was established. Jews in Jelgava established their own schools, hospitals, and open trading places. The largest number of Jewish residents were registered during the times of the Russian Tsarist Empire. In 1835, there were 4,987 Jews in Jelgava, but in 1881, their numbers reached 6,295. During World War I, Russian military authorities forced many Jews to leave Jelgava and go to Russia. After the war, in 1935, during Independent Republic of Latvia, there were 2,039 Jews in Jelgava. The historically established Jewish community of Jelgava was exterminated during the Holocaust in July 1941, when Jelgava was occupied by Nazi German troops. 25 years after World War II, in 1970, during Soviet times, there were 20 Jews in Jelgava. Rabbi Levi Ovchinsky, the author of the book Jews in Kurzeme, Professor Max Lazarison, and Rabbi Mordechai Murak, both politicians, were three of the most outstanding members of Jelgava's 20th century Jewish community. Today there is a small Jewish community in Jelgava. They have gathered themselves around their cultural identity. Andris Rimsha, a student of Jelgava's Spidla High School. This is one of the cases where we can witness the scornful attitude of some people towards our history. Andris Tomašūns, historian. 6 days after the war started, Germans came into Jelgava. There were some witnesses in Jelgava who remembered a certain Martin Zvagulans, an agronomist and National Guard member. He had been gathering information. He was watching the airport, observing the Soviet planes, following the activities of the police. He turned out to be close to the Germans. In Azargailis' study, the name Vagulans appears very clearly. It is obvious that he was a security officer of the highest rank among the Latvians in Jelgava and the surrounding region. On June 29th, Germans appointed him as the head of the security service. On June 30th, Vagulans started publishing a newspaper 2 days before the paper Tevija started coming out in Riga. Vagulans' paper was called the National Zemgala. 42 issues of the newspaper were published, and in August its publication was terminated. Vagulans was writing articles as well as being the editor-in-chief. I can show you some copies of the newspaper at school. The paper was full of anti-Semitic articles. It was openly anti-Semitic from its first days. Among other things, it published the orders issued, for example, that Jews were forbidden to go into certain shops, that Jews were not to walk along certain streets, that they had to move to some other places. In fact, some kind of ghetto began to be formed, that Jews were to hand in radio sets, and that Jews were not to walk along streets. It is clear that the army, with the assistance of the special units, including attempts to involve the local population, tried to organize the extermination of the Jewish population. In Germany, it was not done with such a systematically planned policy of rounding everyone up and of forming special teams to shoot people. Such a policy was seen for the first time in the Baltic region. We are now at the site of the Holokausts hospital. The house in the background used to be a private hospital. Not only Jews, but everyone could come for treatment. As far as I remember, from the days when my mother had to be operated on, the operating theater was fairly modern for those times. Dr. Friedenstein was one of the most popular doctors. Vilis Azevich. I recall several Jews from those times. They were nice people. For example, there was a father and son, both doctors, called Levitas. They were very good doctors. They even sort of saved my life once, because the doctor gave the correct diagnosis and treatment. Jews were vendors, merchants. Edgars Bergmanis. There were many Jews in Jelgava. They had many shops, some of which were very big, like the Hirschman brothers' dry goods store in the center. It was also typical for Jews to be tinsmiths. There were many doctors, also lawyers. There was a shop, I remember, to the Sencheks. When the German troops came into the city, the Jewish staff of the shop put out the red, white, red flag of Latvia and waved at the Germans, welcoming them. They did not know what destiny was awaiting them. They welcomed them with a smile, not knowing what would happen to them later. Lima Runa. We went to Peter Street, to a cellar in a house. The cellar was full of refugees from different houses, and a whole family was there. They said that Russians were leaving the city, and that people were vandalizing shops. Their windows were all smashed, and the shops looted. Soon after the Russians left, the Germans came. I remember I lived at Darza Street 7, and when we went out into the street, one could see a column of troops moving towards the city. There were cyclists and all. Everyone was in their shirt sleeves because the weather was hot. We went closer to see what was happening. The Germans were met with flowers because we greeted them as liberators. After the year of terror and all those horrors, they seemed to be warmly welcomed, although they had been our 700-year-old enemy. As far as I know, the young Latvians joined them immediately. They enlisted in that auxiliary service. Almost all the boys whom I knew from my school joined those units. Asians Kurtniks. At that time I lived in Jelgava. I went to school. Although I have never seen it myself, this was the site of the so-called small synagogue in Jelgava. In July 1941, the Germans burnt the synagogue down. I don't know exactly who burned it because I was not there and I did not see it. Afterwards, the ruins were removed and a water reservoir for fire engines was built. We usually went for strolls along Chakste Boulevard. And once, when we came out onto it from a side street, we noticed a crowd of people. When we went closer, we saw that the synagogue was on fire. Quite a big crowd had gathered. There were also fire engines to make sure that the fire would not spread to other buildings. There were people in German uniforms, also people in the uniforms of the Latvian police. The picture was foreboding, and the people looking at it were also very gloomy. As soon as some of the Jews were taken away, especially if they were rich, our guys went in immediately, and they took everything that seemed useful. It happened right after the people had been taken away. Such things happened. Some of the apartments were taken by Germans. I remember we went to see a flat in Matara Street, and it was empty. It was obvious that the people had left in haste. It was messy. There were things still on the table, an unfinished cup of coffee. You could see they had small kids because there was a feeding bottle left on the table. The feeling was very bad, and rumors spread that Jews were taken out of the city. It was not clear where they would all be taken. Sometimes you saw things in the street. I personally saw it only once. They were escorted along the central street. I remember that in the Desenci shop, some of the dressmakers were Jews, and they were taken away as well. Streets in Jelgava where Jews were forbidden to walk. On the fourth or fifth day, the nationalists, the so-called henchmen of the Germans, started persecuting Jews. And one day, I do not remember the exact date, Jews were rounded up at the end of Vesmana Street, where we are now. I don't know if all the Jews were there, but at least a couple of hundred. Among them, women and children. Both ends of the street were closed, and there were people from the German army. In those days, we did not know what SS and SD were, but they were in German uniforms. Some were in private clothes. There were also Latvians in black overalls, with red, white, red bands around their arms. The inhabitants of Jelgava were very upset because Dr. Freudenstein was a very popular doctor. And since at the time he was our family doctor, we went to see what was happening. At last he was brought in a cab, but when he arrived he was pulled out of it and pushed into the column. Some of the people went to talk to the guards, who spoke Latvian, telling that he was a very respectable doctor, that he had saved many lives, but they wouldn't listen and they pushed him into the column. There was a column of people standing opposite our gate. They were all Jews. They were young and old, women and children. As I was passing through the gate, two Latvians with bands around their arms, they were from the auxiliary service, came along and asked where the Jews lived. Then they went to the top floor of that wooden building. As they were taking away the old people from there, I was coming in through the gate, and the old man asked me if I could buy him shoelaces, because without shoelaces it was hard for him to walk. Since the shoe shop was close by, I ran over and bought the laces. But then these men, our compatriots, those who were escorting them, had a laugh and said, "They won't have far to go. They don't need any shoelaces." Then I did not understand it. Later on, we did find out what it was all about, because one of our family friends was an officer on duty at the police station, and everyone asked him where those Jews were being taken. He said that Hitler had promised to give them land, and they were taken to Lablania. He stayed in the service, but he told me that one was not given orders to take part in the shootings. He said that many refused to do it, but many agreed. He was of a tender nature, and said he would never be able to hurt another human being. There were no Germans among the escort of that column, only the locals, including one of my former neighbors. He had been acquainted with a Baltic German and later married her. Since he was also in that column, I said to him, "Are you also here?" He said yes, with a smile. And in a few days, after the shooting was over, he was telling me that some of his friends had also participated in it. He said that they were first given a proper drink, and that some of the men had become quite drunk and jolly, and that they had been laughing at the young Jewish women who had been ordered to undress, and while naked, they had been trying to cover themselves. He said that was the biggest fun. They were not doing the shooting alone. There were Germans there too. But those who wanted to participate were paid for it, not only with vodka, but money too. Vladimir's Gons. It was not a police battalion. When German Wehrmacht troops came, they did it very efficiently. There was a cook who told about it. Later I was told about it by my father, who knew 4 languages. He said they had been sent from the front on a special mission. You could recognize those people were from the front because they had on iron crosses and all that. And those were the ones. Although we were not there ourselves, we did not see it. But those were the ones that patrolled here as well. It was horrible. It was horrible they were taken away in the first place. And then something like after half an hour there were shots heard. Then silence, and the next group was brought. I think it went on for about a week. It started very early in the morning. Around noon it was all over. At such moments, one had the feeling that one's mind was paralyzed, that you were in the hands of destiny. One had the feeling that those were some sort of savages that had crawled out of the earth, that I had to wait for my turn too. Once those people were exterminated, why should I think it might not happen to me? It was a very depressing and terrible experience. Approximately at this place, I cannot tell exactly, 10 meters here or there, inscriptions started to appear on the 2nd or 3rd day. The first signs were warnings against assisting the bandits. By that, the Red Army was meant. Then there were orders to hand in weapons. But on the 4th and the 5th day, signs appeared by all the main roads going into Jelgava, Mittau Juden frei, which meant Jelgava is free from Jews. The signs were in German and Latvian. Māris Martinsons, director of the museum Jews in Latvia. The man introduced himself as one of the leading Israeli circus artists who was still performing. He gave his name and surname. I mechanically put it down on a slip of paper, but he said he would put down his story himself, that he would come with his written memories the next day. He said I should not write anything, but listen to his stories. He said that in the summer of 1941, he was 15 or 16. He had been on the team of these men who had to cover the ditches with earth in the shooting grounds all around Jelgava. It had always been obvious that those people had been killed there. But they were told that they were POWs and communists, that those were not their people. Yet he had sensed that soon his turn would also come. They had been kept in isolation in a separate house, and the self-appointed head of that team had been the former teacher of the primary school, Bovshowers, to whom he said, "When we finish digging, I will jump into the pit, and you cover me up with sand." He had taken a sack or something like that along, and jumped into the bottom of the pit, and he said that the man had thrown big slabs of soil upon him. I remember very well how angry he still was about it after all these many years. And after some time he heard shots, and something heavy was falling upon him, and he understood that his hunch had been correct. Everyone had been shot, and he was at the bottom of the pit. In the evening he crept out, and went towards the Lithuanian border. Even when I met him, his looks were pretty Aryan. There was nothing Jewish about him. Later the mass graves were blown up, such a wicked and horrid thing, not letting even the dead have peace. Then one could see skulls, shoes, and other things all around. There were ditches here, and there were bones at the bottom of the ditch. It was really barbarous. It couldn't have been more horrid. Germans used the ditches because they were already ready. They had to only cover them up later. They needed ditches and guns.
Vācieši izmantoja tos grāvus, jo viņi bija gatavi. Vajadzēja tikai aizbēgt. Varbūt tad šaujamlauks tos grāvus. Jā, šaujamlauks grāvus. Tātad viņi kādu dziļi nevarēja būt.
I remember somebody had dug pits here looking for something, and bones were scattered around. Māris Martinsons, a student of Jelgava's Spidla High School. I knew about it, but I never paid particular attention to it, because in other places there were also Holocaust victims. I had heard that the Germans exterminated Jews, and genocide was largely caused by Germans who imposed it upon Latvians. German troops occupied Jelgava on the 29th of July, 1941. The German SD commander, Stahlecker, appointed Martins Vagelans as the organizer of the local security service. As of July 30th, the German field commandant's office in Jelgava, headed by Major Schäfer, was already established. Schäfer had military power in all of Kurzeme and Zemgale, except for Ventspils, Liepaja, and a 10-kilometer strip along the sea. Kristaps Friskaus was appointed as the city's mayor. The Latvian Security Service was formed by the authority of Stahlecker as an auxiliary police force starting from July 4th. In Jelgava, the security service, formed by Martins Vagelans, was made subordinate to the field commandant's office, led by Major Schäfer. On July 17th, Hitler issued an order forming the Reichskommissariat Ausland. The Reichskommissar Ausland was Henrik Lose and Commissar General Otto Henrik Drexler, who introduced occupational civil rule. Walter van Medem, Zemgala Commissar, arrived in Jelgava on July 30th. The Wehrmacht commander in Ausland as of July 25th was Lieutenant General Walter Bremer. The German occupation in Jelgava continued until July 1944.
Šie dokumenti, kas stāsta par to, kā Vācijā ķelnē 1963. gadā tika aicināts.
From William Evelt's testimony in Cologne, these are the documents showing how in Cologne, Germany, Alfred Becku and William Evelt were summoned for interrogation. Both had been present as executioners and guards during these crimes against civilization in Jelgava. From my lieutenant, I received the task, together with 8 or 9 men from my company, who belonged to the so-called first echelon, to follow an SD car. I did not know where we were going, but by obeying orders we came to Mittau, also known as Jelgava. The commander of the German security company, the head of the SS commando, was Becku. Then he describes this Becku as a stout and large man, with an energetic face, dark hair, year of birth around 1908, 1910, origins unknown. After a day, Becku told me that we had to do the shooting there, and the rest of my people and I had to protect the shooting grounds from entry by other people. Becku said very clearly that Jews were to be shot. Then together with the police we went to the shooting ground, which was located about 2 to 3 kilometers outside of the city. The Jews were taken to the shooting place by the Latvian police, who had bands on their arms and carbines. Among all those Jews, there were men, women, and children. Men were in the majority. and from what I observed, the groups had not been particularly prepared. The people who were brought over had to first dig a pit, and then they were put in groups of 8 to 10, with their faces to the pit. The shooters were German SD men who stood about 5 to 8 meters from the people rounded up. The execution was performed with carbines. Some SD men shot from their knees, some standing up. I don't know how many shooters there were per person. By the orders of the regiment commander, Beku, the shooting was done in volleys, by command. Some of the accused fell into the pit. Some fell by the pit. The next group of accused had to throw into the pit those who had not fallen in. I could not see if all the victims were immediately dead. I saw Beku going along the pit shooting random test shots. Then the place next to the pit was taken by the next group. They were shot in exactly the same way.
Es redzēju, kā Beku pats gāja gar bedru un izšāva pārbaudas šāvienus. Pēc tam vietu pie bedres ieņēma nākamā apsūdzēto delegāciju. Viņi tika nošauti tieši tādā pašā veidā.
Sand was not put between the separate layers of corpses. When the shooting was over, Latvians covered up the pit. The pit could have been about 20 to 50 meters long and 2 meters deep. In fact, the depth of the pit could have been about 1 meter 80 centimeters. Every day the accused dug a new pit. During the 3 days of shooting, all in all, about 500 to 600 people were shot. After 3 days of shooting, we went back to Riga. Such is the little information available about this tragedy that took the lives of at least 1,500 people. We can learn about the history of our land. We can erect memorial stones and monuments. We can take care of these. But we are not to forget these terrible testimonies of the past. Because by studying history, we have to remember the main thing: occupations by alien powers, genocide against the nation of Latvia, the Holocaust against the Jewish and Romani people should never be repeated.